Okay, let's get to this one. Let's continue with our look at the segregation and ongoing things in the South. So we got sit-in and freedom rides, okay? Sit-in freedom rides, 1960, 1961. In the White House in 1961 is Lyndon Johnson as VP and Kennedy as president. Okay, so we've entered a new decade. We have a new team in the White House. Johnson is, and we talked about Johnson in a previous chapter. Johnson is a New England liberal Democrat. But again, Northern Democrats were far more interested in desegregating the country than Southern Democrats. So you have a New England Democrat in Kennedy and a Southern Democrat in Johnson in the White House. In 1960, 4 African American students at the Greensboro 4 held a sit-in at a whites-only lunch counter in North Carolina. I think there was an image of that we saw a little bit earlier. There should be a little bit of a footage of this, but again, it's not working right in there. I'm sorry. So, the nonviolent sit-ins spread. Now, the African Americans who were sitting in at these counters illegally, because it's against the law, they were nonviolent, but the cops were very violent. The store owners, like Lester Maddox, we talked about in the previous slide, he took an axe at a black man who's trying to enter his store. So the opposition, those who favored segregation, yeah, they were pretty violent at times. So, 1961, interracial groups, white and blacks, rode buses in what were called freedom rides or freedom riders. They sought to go to the South to stop segregation by getting people to register to vote. As a result of these nonviolent protests, at lunch counters were eventually desegregated. As a result of these nonviolent protests, lunch counters were eventually desegregated and the federal government was forced to help. Now again, the sit-ins by the blacks were nonviolent. The freedom rides and the freedom riders were nonviolent. Those opposing them, they were very violent. A number of people were beaten, hospitalized, killed as a result of this. I think we saw an image a little bit earlier of from the book of the water hose being turned upon protesting, peaceful protest. Got just a couple more and we'll be done. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. No, sorry about that. So, Martin Luther King was emerging as the leader of the civil rights movement. His belief in nonviolence, which again was Gandhi-esque, in practicing civil disobedience. He also followed Gandhi when he said things like, everyone, this is Gandhi speaking, has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Like Gandhi, King will also prevail. Like Gandhi, they both will be killed before their task is completed. You'll be finished by others. So, as King is becoming the leader of the civil rights movement because of his adherence to nonviolence, his name is spreading across the country. He's gaining more and more followers, north, south, east, west, white and black. When Martin Luther King led a march in Birmingham, Alabama, he was arrested and jailed. Again, the image we saw from the American Republic book of those kids with the water hose, that was in Birmingham. The sheriff of Birmingham, Bull Connor, turned the hoses, turned the dogs on the peaceful protesters. In a letter from a Birmingham jail, King wrote, and it was smuggled out of the jail and eventually published in many, many newspapers across the country. He explained in this letter why blacks could no longer wait patiently for their rights. While through things like civil disobedience, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, blacks are now going to take a more active role in demanding that their rights be enforced. The rights that are theirs under the Constitution be enforced. Certainly this is ending soon. I thought there was only about 20 slides. Okay. The March on Washington, 1963. The King, I Have a Dream speech. And I will play that for you. In 1963, in order to gain support for civil rights bills that were before Congress, King led a march on Washington, D.C. And here you can see some of his followers. Here he is giving his speech. And here he is in the bottom meeting with Kennedy. This March on Washington in the summer of '63 turned out to be one of the largest, if not the largest, demonstration on human rights in history. It was at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial where he gave I Have a Dream speech. King would later meet with JFK, which of course is that image right there. Okay. Now, this is not overly clear. The speech was given in '63. King was killed in '68. Kennedy was killed a few months later. Okay? So, just so we understand here, and I guess maybe it is a little bit clearer than I thought as I looked at that quickly. A few months later, JFK was killed after he met with King. Again, keep in mind, the speech was in the summer of '63. Kennedy was killed in November of '63, just a few months later. Okay. But there was a new willingness in Congress to pass legislation for civil rights. As I mentioned to you in previous chapters, once Kennedy was killed, Johnson came to a realization that the Democrats needed black votes to maintain a majority in the South. And so Johnson started advocating legislation that was before Congress, and we talk about here, Civil Rights Bill before Congress. Johnson advocates that in the name of the slain president. He is pushing Democrats in the South with no success, but he's pushing Democrats north and south to support this legislation because the blacks have deserved it. They have earned it. Now, in private moments, he's telling these puppies, hey, if we don't do something, we, the Democrat Party, we're going to lose the South. The black population in the South is increasing, and if we don't do something soon, the Democrat Party will be minority in the South. Okay. Civil Rights Act of 1964. Again, here's the headline, Kennedy slain on Dallas streets. Here is an image of JFK being sworn in. Here is Jackie, Kennedy's wife, at the swearing in. And here again is the image we saw in the opening of Kennedy, of FDR, Lyndon Johnson signing civil rights legislation of '64, and that is King behind him. So, the Civil Rights Act of '64. '63, Kennedy's assassinated. LBJ becomes the president. As President LBJ pushes through new legislation on civil rights. '64, the Civil Rights Act of '64. This is signed into law by LBJ just really a few months after the death of Kennedy and a few months after LBJ becomes president. The law, and the law we're referring to here, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The law would prohibit discrimination based on race, color, religion, or ethnic background in hotels, restaurants, and all places of employment that does business with the federal government. So essentially, we're looking at pretty much everywhere in the country. Schools get money from the federal government, so this law affects them. You're a private company, you own a private company, but you have a contract with the federal government, you cannot discriminate anymore. Whether you're in Little Rock, Arkansas, Tupelo, Mississippi, or New York City. And so this is really the first major piece of civil rights legislation, again, prohibiting discrimination on race, color, religion, or ethnic background. Really the first significant piece of civil rights legislation since the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Okay. Yeah, you think you're tired. I'm the one doing all the talking. 24th Amendment, 1964. Eliminated poll taxes in federal election. And what's a poll tax? A poll tax is charging someone for the right to vote. (1965) Selma marches. Martin Luther King marches in Selma, Alabama to demand voting rights for African Americans, but the demonstrators, those marching in favor of desegregating, were attacked by the police. And here is an image of some of those attacks, or at least the beginning of it. You see when the police officer there. 1965 Voting Rights Act. Voting Rights Act of 65. LBJ signed into law a bill that ended poll taxes and led on an increased number of black voters. So, the 24th Amendment says no more poll taxes, but we now need a federal law and a punishment if that law is broken. Again, what's some backward cracker judge in Tupelo, Mississippi going to do with a federal constitutional amendment or a federal law? Going to ignore it unless there's some way to punish him for breaking that law. And that is what that did right there. Now this chart is a little bit difficult to see. But let me walk you through it. So here we have in Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia. In March of 1965, which is our second column there, in March of 1965, okay. I'm sorry, let me get that out of the way so you can see it. There we go. We had the percentage of black voters, white voters, and then the gap, the difference between the two of them. For example, Alabama, 19.3% blacks were registered to vote as compared to 69.2% of whites, a difference of 49.9%. The smallest of the gap, is down here in Virginia, 22.8%, which means there were 22.8% more white registered voters than black voters. And this again is in March of 65. Now, we go to the next column, November of 68. We see the column of black voters increasing dramatically. We see the number of white voters increasing. But what we see now with this gap is a huge decrease. In fact, in Louisiana, blacks have the majority of registered voters. So in Alabama, it goes from 49.9% more white voters than black voters to only 6.6%. So the civil rights legislations, the Voting Rights Acts, had a huge success. Affirmative action. 1965. 1965, LBJ signs an executive order requiring employers with the federal government to take positive steps. Now again, what is a positive step? Well, that's kind of left up to the courts to determine. To increase minority employees. Later, women were added to this. So in 1965, an executive order is passed, what we refer to as affirmative action, requiring government employers to increase minority employees, to go out and actively recruit minority employees. A few years down the road, women were added to that. So it's both women and minorities. Well, women, of course, are perceived to be a minority, though they're not. Actually, there are more women in the country than there are men. Men are actually the minority in this country, but we still call women minorities. So, affirmative action becomes the law of the land. These programs increase the number of minorities in colleges. And here's an example of a young African-American woman in college. In colleges and in businesses. But some said that this was a form of reverse discrimination. So instead of discriminating against blacks, we're now discriminating against whites. Now again, that argument has been made again and again and again, and there is some validity to it, a small amount. If you have, well, let's do Bakke, and then I'll explain this. So in the last bullet here, Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. And there is Mr. Bakke right there. The Supreme Court upheld affirmative action, but did not use racial quotas. Now again, affirmative action essentially became quotas. You must have a certain number of blacks or Hispanics or women, whatever the case may be, employed if you are a part of the government. Eventually this was extended to the entire country. So Bakke sued the University of California, stating that his scores, his grades were superior to black students, and this should have been the University of California Law School. That his grades and scores were superior to black students who got in, and they only got in because of affirmative action. So therefore, that is racist. So, back to Bakke. Again, the Bakke case upheld affirmative action, but not the use of racial quotas. So we can't have a certain number of blacks entering law school at UT, or a certain number of women entering medical school at wherever, okay, at Baylor, just for a couple examples. So a minority status, whether it be race or gender, can be used, but it's not supposed to be a main issue. It's not supposed to be one of the main criteria. This is the last one. You can applaud, I am inside. Billy Graham. Billy Graham is still alive to this day. He is a televangelist. He was an outspoken supporter of civil rights. Here he is with Kennedy. Here he is with King. In fact, according to this right here in our third bullet, Graham became an opponent of segregation, even paid to get Martin Luther King out of jail when he was in Birmingham. Let's go back even further. There is Graham, and that's Dwight David Eisenhower, President of the United States from 52 through 60. So Billy Graham is a Christian preacher. I believe he's Baptist. Go fight with Baptist. And he has been a spiritual advisor to several presidents. In fact, up until his recent bad health, Billy Graham was welcome at every White House of every president. In fact, he became pretty buddy with Bill Clinton. And I remember this when it happened. A lot of people, ooh. Graham made the comment, well, Christ hung out with tax collectors and whores. I can hang out with Bill Clinton. Now, he cleaned it up a little bit because he's educated, and I'm a teacher, and I'm not. But you get the idea. Basically, what he's saying is, sinners need me more than anyone else. And Bill Clinton's the biggest sinner in America. course, this is when he was cheating with every woman, get his hands on, raping, molesting, preying upon women in the White House. So, finally, just one last cool thing about Graham. He advised, and again, this is what we're looking at right here. He advised Ike to send troops in to protect the black students who were trying to enter Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas. The Little Rock 9. Graham advised him, again, he couldn't tell him because Graham's just a preacher and Ike is the President of the United States, but he advised him, this is the right thing to do. And so here we have Billy Graham, again, who is still alive to this day. Though he, of course, no longer ministers. I mean, he is in his 90s and had some health issues. But he has visited with in fact, I think he visited with with Obama early in the Obama administration when he still has some good health. So again, going back to the 50s through now, this man has advised and worked with presidents here in the United States. A huge advocate of ending segregation. A huge supporter of Martin Luther King. We're done. Go fight, win. Thank God we're done.